I may be covered in cat hair, but I still smell good. Baby, let me know, how do I look in my do-rag? Don't lie to me, let me rock you all night long. I'm trying to impress you, girl.
And you're getting high in the middle of the afternoon off some weed.
I want to give something to all of my fantasy football players out there. At the beginning of the season, I did a lot of fantasy football specials going on with the draft, going on with just free agency, just going on with just even starting your league as a new person. I did a lot of fantasy football specials. I'll definitely drop all the links below so that you can see them if you want to go back at the beginning of next year, get some information, because I'm definitely going to be doing that again next year. And we're going to be getting even more fantasy football talk going in next year. I may have more time to focus on different fantasy football things. I'm going to be doing a lot less leagues and stuff to be able to give myself more time to present y'all with information on it. But I want to give something to my fantasy footballers out there. I mean, like I said earlier in the podcast, we're going into week 13 of the NFL season, and in most fantasy football cases, that's the last week of the regular season. If not the last week, it's the second to last week. Most fantasy football playoffs are weeks 14, 15, and 16. If you run week 17, you're a weirdo. But in most cases, like I said, weeks 14 through 16 are going to be your playoff weeks. So going into these fantasy football playoffs, I would like to talk to y'all about who my projected fantasy football MVPs of the playoffs are going to be. We can all talk and we can all argue as much as we want in the offseason about who the regular season MVPs at each position are going to be. But right now we're going to be focusing on, in these next 3 weeks, weeks 14, 15, 16. Who are going to be the MVPs? Who are going to be those players like Todd Gurley was in 2018, that if you have this player on your team, could potentially be the reason you won the league this year? So today we're going to be diving into each position, and we're going to be diving into my MVP and a couple of other really good players that you may also pick up that I don't think are going to be as good as the MVP player that I choose, but they are going to be definite impact players that you're going to want to have on your team in fantasy football. The trade season's already over, but if you find yourself finding one of these players on your team, you're going to be happy here in a couple weeks. So of course, we're just going to go in order of a typical lineup setup. The first position we're going to hit is going to be the quarterback. Some people consider it the most important position. Maybe it's the most important position on the field, but it's not the most important position in fantasy, but we'll get into that later. But I feel like this one is not going to be any surprise to anybody. It really didn't take much work, much research, much thought. The most valuable quarterback that you're going to be able to have on your team in fantasy football going into the 2020 playoffs is going to be that bad man, Patrick Mahomes. He took the bad man title from Aaron Rodgers because I don't think there's anybody badder than Patrick Mahomes out there, especially when you're looking at him in a fantasy football perspective. I mean, if we've learned anything this season and any season prior, mobile quarterbacks are gold mines in fantasy football. If you got a quarterback that can also get some yardage with his legs and score touchdowns with his legs as well, you got a little pure gold nugget sitting on your fantasy football lineup. So being a mobile quarterback definitely improves your stock in any sense of the form. Even Daniel Jones becomes a better quarterback than he typically would be in any other sense because he can run the ball a little bit better. But Patrick Mahomes is a mobile quarterback. Like I've said before, he's shown us that he can beat you 3 ways: with his brain, with his arms, and with his legs. That man is fast. He's quick. He is scrambly. You definitely cannot catch Patrick Mahomes in the pocket, and he's just a magician back there. It's hard to get Pat down there for a sack. Not only that, though, Patrick Mahomes has the 4th easiest schedule amongst quarterbacks coming up in weeks 14, 15, and 16. Got games against Miami, New Orleans, and Atlanta. And New Orleans and Atlanta are potential high-scoring matchups that Patrick Mahomes could just absolutely eat up the points in. Then, of course, you have to consider the fact that, of course, Patrick Mahomes' weapons are absolutely immaculate. I mean, it's the one thing that even if Patrick Mahomes wasn't Patrick Mahomes, if it was Alex Smith, it'd be hard to not choose Alex Smith as a quarterback at this current moment on this team, just with the weapons that are around him. I mean, you have playmakers at every position. Anybody that Patrick Mahomes throws the ball to is liable to run the ball down the field 99 yards and score a touchdown. But then, of course, we always have to consider the fact that teams tend to play their best football against the Kansas City Chiefs. Maybe it's because of the reigning Super Bowl champions of last season, or maybe it's because They may just be the best NFL team, the most powerful NFL team, the most scary NFL team to run up on. So when people come against the Kansas City Chiefs, they tend to play their best football. Not saying that they even play good football as compared to the Kansas City Chiefs, but people definitely do seem to take it a little bit differently when they're running up against Kansas City. So you've seen the Las Vegas Raiders take the Kansas City Chiefs into a surprising shootout game. You've seen the Chargers take the Kansas City Chiefs into a surprising shootout game. You've seen teams push the Kansas City Chiefs to that envelope and force Patrick Mahomes to have to be Patrick Mahomes. And it's not going to change as the season progresses, as things get harder, as people try to play spoiler. The schedule is only going to get tougher for the Kansas City Chiefs in the fact that people are going to be taking the game more serious every week as it comes. So without a doubt, Patrick Mahomes is going to be the quarterback MVP of the playoffs. Now, the other two quarterbacks that I want you to take your attention towards, and if you have these quarterbacks on your team, you definitely want to plug and play them in the playoffs. You're going to be looking at first that rookie sensation Justin Herbert from the Los Angeles Chargers. He's been extremely impressive. And you're seeing week to week him growing a better connection with his wide receivers and with his pass catchers. Every week it's getting better. And amongst quarterbacks, Justin Herbert has the easiest playoff schedule with matchups against Atlanta, Las Vegas, and Denver on the slate. So Justin Herbert's definitely going to be a quarterback that you definitely want to start on your fantasy lineup if you have him. And congrats to you for picking him up off the waiver wire or just taking the chance and drafting him earlier this season. Another quarterback that I want you to point your attention to is going to be that man Jared Goff coming out of Los Angeles as well. Jared Goff has an absolutely amazing, a cakewalk in schedule coming up in the playoffs. He's got New England, the Jets, and then Seattle. Now, Seattle doesn't seem like a cakewalk necessarily, being that they're one of the most highly touted teams in the NFC, but Seattle, they're letting up the most points per game to opposing quarterbacks in a fantasy football perspective. There is no team that is playing worse against opposing quarterbacks than the Seattle Seahawks. So you're looking at Jared Goff's schedule coming up, and the same thing that you're looking at with Patrick Mahomes and that you're looking at with Justin Herbert. The weapons that are around Jared Goff are absolutely immaculate. You got Woods, you got Kupp, he's got great connections with his tight ends. All of his running backs are coming out of the backfield in different ways. He's got great connection with all of his pass catchers, and he's got good weapons around him. Jared Goff definitely has great potential to be another good impact player on your fantasy football playoff team. Now, of course, moving into the most position in the fantasy football team. Yeah, you heard it here first. You heard it right. The most important position on the fantasy football team, the running back. And again, I feel like this one's another easy one. It doesn't take much effort. It doesn't take much research to figure out that Derrick Henry is going to be the most valuable player in a running back perspective. But I don't think just the most valuable running back. I think Derrick Henry has potential to be the fantasy football playoff MVP. And when I say MVP, I mean scoring the most accumulative points in the fantasy football playoffs. I have no doubt in my mind that Derrick Henry is going to be the most valuable running back, but I also, like I said, think he's going to be the most valuable fantasy football player in all senses in the fantasy football playoffs. I mean, Derrick Henry, of course, is one of the few running backs still healthy that's getting 20 carries a game. Derrick Henry has proven time and time again that he's not really touchdown dependent. He will get the yards, and the touchdowns on the top of it are just icing on the cake. But he also has by far the easiest running back schedule in the playoffs. He has 3 teams coming up, Jacksonville, Detroit, and Green Bay, all ranking in the bottom 6 in points allowed versus opposing running backs. So he's getting ready to run through some paper thin defenses when he comes up into this weeks 14 through 16. So like I said, I have no doubt in my mind that Derrick Henry is going to absolutely dominate this fantasy football playoffs. Another running back that I do think is going to make a big impact, though, is going to be Aaron Jones from the Green Bay Packers. I mean, he's proven this year that he is explosive. He also has big playability. He also is a really good contributor in the passing game, and they have a good passing game with Aaron Rodgers being back there, so it forces teams to be honest. The Green Bay Packers have a good O-line when healthy, and they also are coming up on schedule. They got Detroit and Carolina both ranking in the bottom 5 in points allowed to opposing running backs. And then they also have Tennessee up on the schedule as well, which is a low-tier a low mid-tier defense against opposing running backs, and they've been taking a lot of injuries to key players like Jadeveon Clowney on their defensive line, so they're starting to become compromised on that running perspective. So I think Aaron Jones is going to be another big impact player. Another really big impact player that I think will have a big impact on your running back position in fantasy football is going to be Raheem Mostert from the San Francisco 49ers. He's had a very injury-riddled year, but there's no denying that when Raheem Mostert has been healthy, he has been a really fun running back to watch, explosive as all hell, and a really big playability player. I mean, with how everybody else has been getting injured between Jerick McKinnon, JaMychal Hasty, and everything like that, he doesn't have a guaranteed backup running back, and he definitely does take the hot hand most times than not when it comes to the San Francisco 49ers running game. But they also have an absolutely amazing schedule coming up as well, so all things are pointing up for Raheem Mostert being activated off injured reserve and playing well last week. Now, moving on to the wide receiver position, I'm going to focus on, my MVP is going to pick one wide receiver, but I'm going to pick two wide receiver duos for my other impact players, because the reasons that I didn't pick these other wide receivers is because of the competition that they have on their team. So it's hard to pick one wide receiver over the other, because it's hard to even pick one wide receiver over the other on their own teams. But if there's one wide receiver that I really think is going to make the biggest impact out of all wide receivers in fantasy football playoffs, it's going to be Stefon Diggs out of Buffalo. I mean, he's had an absolutely quietly consistent year, but Stefon Diggs is still Stefon Diggs. He's not making them big purple fireworks like he was out in Minnesota, but Stefon Diggs is not changed at all. Stefon Diggs has also proven to us all that he is absolutely Josh Allen's favorite target on the team. He has at least 6 catches in all but one game this season. He has 5 games with 8 or more catches. Stefon Diggs has really just been about as consistent as you can ask for. He has an extremely high floor with the amount of targets that he's getting. And he has good enough talent around him to keep defenses honest, but not that they're going to be stealing any targets from him. Cole Beasley's not going to be competing with Stefon Diggs for targets. Stefon doesn't really have to compete with John Brown for targets. The running game, Devin Singletary and Zach Moss aren't going to be stealing any targets. There's no doubt that Stefon Diggs is the focal point of that Buffalo Bills team. They're a hot team right now, and if they're going to continue to succeed, it's going to be on the back of Stefon Diggs, just like the Minnesota Vikings did. Now, as far as the wide receiver duos that you're going to be wanting to look to have on your team, not saying that you want to have both of them, but having one of these 2 wide receivers on your team is going to make you happy. These wide receiver duos are going to make big impacts in the fantasy football playoffs. The first one I want to look at is that fantasy football duo being led by the quarterback that I mentioned earlier, Jared Goff. You're looking at Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. This fantasy duo got off to a kind of rough start, but they also had a rough schedule, and the Rams got off to a rough start as a whole, as it was anyway. But Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp both have explosive big playability, and they've also got a progressively easier schedule as the playoffs continue through. And it's getting capped off with a Week 16 matchup against the division opponent Seattle Seahawks, which, aforementioned, allow the most points to opposing wide receivers in a fantasy football perspective. So they have a great matchup in the fantasy football Super Bowl. So if you can make it that far, having Stefon Diggs and Cooper Kupp, it just gets better every week as the playoffs progress. But the other wide receiver duo that I want to point you to, this one's going to be pretty easy one. It's kind of obvious, I feel like. Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Coming back, fully healthy Chris Godwin. And then you got Mike Evans. They got Tom Brady at quarterback. What else do I need to say after that? I mean, if I was to add anything else on that, it would be that they also have other pass catchers around them, so it's keeping teams honest. They have such a star-studded cast with Ronald Jones in the backfield, Leonard Fournette in the backfield, Rob Gronkowski. You have both wide receivers complemented by Scotty Miller and the other wide receivers that have been stepping up in the absence of Chris Godwin. There's no way that you can focus primarily on either one, double team either one, so they're always going to have that opportunity. Mike Evans is a really big target. Chris Godwin is a really fast target. So they kind of give you that beautiful mix that you want. So I definitely find that if you have either one of the Buccaneers wide receivers or either one of the Los Angeles Rams wide receivers, you're almost as happy as if you have Stefon Diggs on your team. Now, moving on to the tight end position, this has been the worst dumpster fire of fantasy football, honestly, maybe even of 2020. Unless you have Travis Kelce or Darren Waller, you pretty much know that the tight end position has been absolute trash this year. It's been a streamer's nightmare. It's absolutely impossible to figure out which tight end is going to be going off, I'm the unlucky son of a bitch that drafted George Kittle, expecting a top 3 tight end, and he just really only played 4 games. Unfortunately, injury took him out. That's a part of the game. But since then, I've been struggling at tight end, and I know everybody else has, like I said, unless you got Kelsey or Waller. But which tight end is going to make the biggest impact in the fantasy football playoffs? I'm going to hit you with a surprise one here. Mine's going to be Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles. They have definitely even come out and already said that Dallas Goedert and fellow tight end Zach Ertz are going to be the 2 most reliable pass catchers on the team. I mean, can you seriously name me the number 1 wide receiver of Philadelphia? I'm going to wait for it. You might have been able to do it. It's Jalen Reagor or Travis Fulgham. But do either one of those names impress you? Not me myself. Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert are 100% the focal point of the Philadelphia Eagles, especially with Miles Sanders returning from injury, not fully at 100% yet. The whole offense is going to flow right through those 2 big twin towers. Zach Ertz has been injured over the last little bit, actually on injured reserve, and Richard Rodgers has stepped up and played well in that role. But Zach Ertz is getting ready to return to that role and take the place of Richard Rodgers. And some people might argue and say, why are you considering Dallas Goedert when Zach Ertz is coming back off injured reserve? You may be one of those people that are forgetting that Zach Ertz has been playing second fiddle to Dallas Goedert since last season. Dallas Goedert has been on the rise. Zach Ertz has been proven that he's been fragile. And as soon as Zach Ertz got injured the first time last season in 2019, Dallas Goedert came out and proved himself. And ever since then, they've been running with both tight ends and progressively going more towards Dallas Goedert. And Zach Ertz is kind of taking that back seat. So I honestly have to say that Dallas Goedert is going to become one of the most powerful weapons in the NFL as far as pass catchers are concerned. And as far as tight ends go, like I said earlier, if you've been playing fantasy football, you understand that tight end has been a big crapshoot this season, and you're basically depending on a tight end to score a touchdown in order to make any sort of impact in fantasy football. So when you're looking at a tight end, matchups make a really big impact on tight end more than they do any other position. And when you look at the matchups, no tight end has a really amazing matchup coming up. No tight end has a beautiful, perfect slate, 14, 15, and 16 all 3 weeks. But Dallas Goedert has 3 middle-of-the-road, bottom middle-tier teams that he's getting ready to come up against. He's got New Orleans, Arizona, and the Dallas Cowboys. All 3 teams that have been letting up numbers to the tight end position, so Dallas Goedert is going to have those opportunities. Like I said, I have no doubt in my mind that Dallas Goedert will be the most valuable tight end target that you will find in fantasy football playoffs this season. But another one that you can really point to is going to be Jimmy Graham from the Chicago Bears. I mean, he has the most targets of any player in the NFL right now inside the 10-yard line. He is a red zone magnet. I mean, he's a big man. He's got great hands, and he's a journeyman, but he's proven it to us from team to team to team that he's been on that Jimmy Graham is reliable. He's got those hands. And if you've ever watched Sunday Night Football where Jimmy Graham is playing, then you know Jimmy Graham played basketball in college, and he's got those hops. Chris Collinsworth loves that fact. So he's got that basketball ability. He's got that leaping ability. He's got those hands. He's got that reliability. He's been fairly inconsistent this year, but the one thing that's going in Jimmy Graham's favor is his schedule coming up. And like I said, he's got the most targets inside the 10-yard line. Another tight end that you may be happy with having on your team for the fantasy football playoffs is going to be the Gronk himself, man, Rob Gronkowski, who really thought in 2020 going in from 2019 that we would seriously be saying Rob Gronkowski is going to be one of the best tight end impact players in fantasy football. Not me, for damn sure. But there's no denying that. Rob Gronkowski and Tom Brady have that connection. They've had that connection. That's the one thing that had everybody thinking about Rob Gronkowski coming into this year. He didn't really get off on the right foot, but it was also coming off of a retirement. If you saw pictures of Rob Gronkowski when he was retired, he was definitely not in football shape. I was surprised he was even able to come back and be even a fraction of the Gronkowski that we know and that we love. But there's no denying that he's one of Tom Brady's favorite targets. He's a big red zone target, very similar to Jimmy Graham. And he's also got the second easiest playoff schedule amongst tight ends following Jimmy Graham. So if you're looking at the matchups and what's going to be going in a person's favor, like I said, Jimmy Graham and Rob Gronkowski have everything on paper that they need to be big impact players on your tight end team. But I think Dallas Goedert is going to be the tight end that you want to have on your team coming into fantasy football playoffs. Now, closing it out, I want to pick the defense because it's hard to pick multiple defenses that are going to have those big impact. But I want to pick the one defense that I think is definitely going to be, without a doubt, the number one defense throughout the playoffs. And it's going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers, sitting currently as the number one defense, barely holding on behind the Indianapolis Colts. But the Pittsburgh Steelers have amazing matchups coming up in weeks 14, 15, and 16 on the offensive side of the ball. But besides the point of that, the Pittsburgh Steelers are seemingly bulletproof on the defensive side of the ball. Even against their best opponents on their schedule, they haven't necessarily disappointed. They haven't scored high points, but they haven't disappointed in any sense of the word. I think the lowest points total that they scored in this year in a standard league would be, I think, 4 points, and you're not happy with that, but that's not like a -5 like the Indianapolis Colts put up this week in a standard PPR scoring. That Pittsburgh Steelers team are a bunch of ball hawks. You saw tonight when they were playing the Baltimore Ravens. They're always punching the ball. They get turnovers like no other. They've got 4 interceptions in one game, 2 interceptions. They've got multiple interceptions in, I believe, 6 games this season. They are creating turnovers. They're scoring. They are definitely doing everything that you want to see in your defense. And I don't see any changing coming up in the Pittsburgh Steelers, especially coming through their weeks 14, 15, and 16 matchups, the Indianapolis Colts being one of them. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the Indianapolis Colts are going to scorch that defense. But like I said, I think that Pittsburgh Steelers is going to be the most consistent defense to run with in fantasy football, and they're going to be the highest scoring defense in the fantasy football playoffs coming up. Next week, we got a lot of big topics coming up. NBA is getting back started. I actually just got a notification while I was recording the episode today that the Rockets just made that big blockbuster trade that we've all been kind of waiting for, and Russell Westbrook is getting sent for John Wall. So we're going to be discussing a lot of NBA stuff coming up. Like I said, we got the NBA coming up here in just a few weeks. We got a lot more NFL news coming up and a lot more wacky, wild sports going on in the NFL, in the world, and in the 2020 year, and going into next year and seeing what we're excited about. But again, man, I'd like to really thank y'all so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Huddle Chat Sports Show. I'm the host, Dallas Clark, also known as Indo as my Nindo, and I'm going to catch y'all next week. Stay safe. Stay high, and stay blazing out there, y'all. And don't forget, smoke 'em if you got 'em.
I may be covered in cat hair, but I still smell good. Baby, let me know, how do I look in my do-rag? Don't lie to me, let me rock you all night long. I'm trying to impress you, girl.
And you're getting high in the middle of the afternoon off some weed